fifth and final forum with the candidates for office on November 6th. This is being brought to you by Cayuga Community College and The Citizen. I'm your moderator, Guy Cosentino. On November 6th, voters across the state of New York get to vote for members of the New York State Legislature, 63 members of the Senate, and 150 members of the Assembly. Cayuga County has 2 assembly districts, the 130, which is now represented by Assemblyman Bob Oakes, who is retiring at the end of the year. He covers most of northern Cayuga County. And the 126, which is currently represented by Assemblyman Gary D. Finch, which includes the city of Auburn, the town of Troop, and points south in Cayuga County, and covers parts of Onondaga, including Skaneateles and Elbridge, as well as parts of Cortland and Shenango counties. This year, the 2 candidates happen to be from southern Cayuga County that are running for this office. We are delighted to have them both here in the studio to answer questions about themselves, the issues that are facing the district and the state overall. They'll be asked questions in a few moments by Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen, whose weekly column appears on the editorial page of The Citizen every Thursday, and is again asking the questions as he has for all 5 forums. Our candidates are sitting in the order of their opening statements, which was done by a draw. It is Assemblyman Gary D. Finch, who is on the Republican, Conservative, Independent, and Reform parties, and his opponent, Cayuga County Legislator Keith Batman, who is on the Democratic Women's Equality Party and Working Families Party. I want to welcome you both and thank you for appearing today. As we said, we'll give you 2 minutes as an opening statement. We have Autumn, who's a student here, who will give you the high sign at 1.5 minutes, and at 2 minutes she'll hold up a red card, which hopefully will have you stop where you are in your comments. So with that, we will have Assemblyman Gary D. Finch. I said before, he's on the Republican, Conservative, Independent, and Reform Party lines. Assemblyman, welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, Guy. It's exciting to be here. I would like to thank the college first for hosting us today, and this wonderful team you have here, and Jeremy Boyer as well, and The Citizen for sponsoring it, and Guy for your good guidance moderating it. There are a number of things that certainly are critical that are going on right now in the Assembly District. And the most important one, at least the one I feel is most important, is the condition of our lakes. I have 4 of the Finger Lakes in the district, which is a little bit unusual to have that many lakes. We have Atisco, Skaneateles, Owasco, and Cayuga. There are 11 lakes all in all. Stretch themselves across the middle of New York State. They are in jeopardy. There's the blue-green algae is an issue that's putting toxin in the water. We need to have safe drinking water for over 150,000 people. So that's one of the issues that's sitting there. We have a critical epidemic with heroin and opiates. That has to be dealt with. We have people dying every day of the week for that. We have, there are more people dying from overdoses of heroin than die in automobile accidents now. That's tragic. We need to do something there. And we need to be able to provide a safe place for our children to go to school. I served on the, actually chaired the School Safety Task Force, and that we came back with some recommendations for that. But we need to have safe places for children to go to school. There are more than just that we're dealing with right now. Those are the top 3 issues, I think. And I hope we can have some questions in regard to the other major issues as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblyman. We'll now hear from Cayuga County Legislator Keith Batman, who is on the Democratic Women's Equality Party and Working Families Party. Legislator.
Thank you very much. I too, of course, am very pleased to be here today to talk about the issues, to answer questions, and discuss with Mr. Finch. I think we'll have little disagreement on what the issues are that are facing us. I would add to his list, and I'm sure he would agree, that we have issues of infrastructure, we have issues of jobs, we have issues of ethics, and there's some others I think we'll probably get into. The question today is who is best positioned to lead this district in finding solutions for those problems and getting the resources we need to solve them. I think I'm uniquely prepared. everyone knows, I hope, at this point that I've been on a school board. I've been on the county legislature, chair of that body in 16 and 17. I served as supervisor in the town of Scipio, and I'm not going to go through that again. What I do want to talk about, however, is some other ways that I'm prepared. I went to college, back to college as an adult, and spent about 16 years going to school, working full-time, sometimes going to school full-time, sometimes part-time. But during that period of time, I had a variety of jobs. I worked as a janitor in a high school. I worked on an assembly line making televisions. I bussed tables. I washed dishes. Once I finished my bachelor's degree, I was fortunate enough to work at the Cayuga County Health Department and Employment and Training Department, where I learned a great deal about county government as well as health policy and employment training. When I finished my MBA at Syracuse University in my mid-30s, I was fortunate enough to get a job at Cayuga Community College in continuing education, where I was able to help people like myself who was returning to school, having to work, raise a family, many responsibilities, but motivated to make their lives better and their community's life better. Part of what I've learned through this is what I was taught by my parents. My parents taught me the value of hard work. They taught me the value of community. And these are values that I've taken with me throughout my life. I particularly like to speak about community because it's so important to me. I think the legislature, the assembly particularly, is the closest thing to community. That is why I am so focused on doing the right thing for our community and being a voice in Albany for our community. That's what I look forward to do, and thank you.
Thank you, Legislator. We'll now have questions from Mr. Boyer. He can ask them of either of you or both of you. We'll switch back and forth and rotate. As we said at the beginning, you'll have 2 minutes to answer. Autumn will be keeping time on that. If you want to follow up on something that your opponent has said, just give me the high sign. We'll give you another minute, and we'll keep to the idea that you both will get equal time. Mr. Boyer, welcome back.
Thank you, and thanks to both of you for coming today and for taking a few minutes to answer some questions. We'll try to get through as many topics as we can and hopefully give people a sense of some of the stances that you each have. Assemblyman Finch, you started off by talking about the water quality challenge. And we certainly have seen that in Owasco Lake, but also in Cayuga and Skaneateles Lakes. Otisco has been sort of fortunate so far, to my knowledge, but in all three cases we've had some state response, some local response, and some mixed reaction as far as how effective all this has been. So I'd like for both of you to basically do it in 2 steps. Assess what has happened so far in response to the water quality issues, and then talk about what you want to see happening going forward.
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Finch.
Well, Owasco Lake has always been a concern, as all the lakes are, but I think the group of ALA has been around for some 20 years, and they've been they've been custodians of the lake, checking it, getting water samples over the last 20 years. And so it's become probably the most visible, the most talked about of all the Finger Lakes. Several years ago, this blue-green algae started to appear, and it's something that's been around for some 10,000 years. But it became to manifest itself in another way. It died off and produced a toxin, and the toxin got in the water supply for the drinking water, and that became a main issue at the time, and still is. Everything has to sort of come up. You have to have the right temperature. You have to have the right the water temperature, the temperature of the air, the sunlight, the ability for this algae to move at different levels within the lake. It's very complex, but if once it reaches a critical point, it dies, probably in mid-August, and produces this toxin. Now, what had to be done was, after some assessment, there was the toxin must be filtered out of the water, and the city of Auburn did not have the ability to do that, nor did the town of Owasco. Both entities draw water from the lake. So we had to come up with some kind of a solution, and what it was the filtration, a charcoal filter process. And it's worked so far. But it hasn't gotten the toxin out of the water of the lake, only the drinking water. So the other problem is we've got to figure out how to get it out of the lake before it even gets into the system. It's very complex, but I think we're moving in the right direction. It's a very expensive process. The
Thank you, Assemblyman.
the filters cost about $1.2 million for the Owasco Lake only.
Mr. Batman, on this issue of what has been done and where you're going on water quality issues.
Okay, well, let me start with that first thing of what we've done. I've been involved in water issues for well over 10 years, maybe 15 years, and during that period of time as supervisor in Scipio and the county legislature, I've been involved in a number of efforts. Some of the efforts involve fracking waste on our roads. Some of the efforts involved attacking the problems of invasive species. Some of the problems involved, as Mr. Finch has mentioned, the issues of blue-green algae and the deterioration of our drinking water. So many things have been done over time by ALA, by government, and by others in order to attempt to address the issue. Fundamentally, though, if we look at what we've done to date, what we've done really is to react to a problem. And at some point, and I think some point soon, we need to become more aggressive in looking at the root causes. We do not know exactly what causes the pollution and the deterioration of the water, but we do know that nutrient loading is a critical issue, and it's nutrient loading that we need to focus on. One of the things that's critically important to understand is that there is no one source of nutrient loading. Agriculture plays a role, yes. Roadside ditch maintenance plays a role, yes. Construction, yes. Golf courses, yes. But also, one of the things we sometimes forget is those of us who live in the watershed but not on the lake, we forget that what we put on the ground gets to the water. And so the solution to this, the underlying solution, is for all of us to be more aware of the problems, more aware of the problems we create, more aware of the problems that we, or the actions that we take that contribute to the problem. And we all need to act together to move toward a solution. That's one of the things I look forward to taking a lead on. I've been a leader in the reactionary component, and I look forward to being a leader in the solution part of the component.
Mr. Boyer.
Well, you touched on one issue I wanted to follow up on, and that's the impact of agriculture in the watershed, because although you rightly point out there's many factors, a lot of evidence has pointed to that being a big factor, and that leads to the question of what to do about it. And some people have suggested tighter regulations, stronger oversight, stiffer enforcement. Just want to know where you each stand on the issue of agriculture and how to reduce its impact on the water.
Okay. We'll go with Mr. Batman first.
Okay. Yeah, there's no question that agriculture is a major factor in nutrient loading. The issue is if you pointed out, is how are we going to confront it? What are we going to do about it? The Cayuga County actually put together, or I put together when I was chair, a working group to really look at the issue of nutrient loading and manure management in Cayuga County. And we came up with a series of recommendations that we hope will be implemented over time that are best practices associated with agricultural production for all farms. We have a system now with CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, which apply to large farms. Each of them have to have a nutrient management plan which includes all kinds of things, including the issues of nutrient loading and movement of soil off the land. So a lot's being done in terms of these best management plans. We have to accept the fact, though, that not enough is being done. If enough were being done, we wouldn't have a problem. So clearly, there needs to be more done. One of the issues that we need to confront as we look at this problem is the influence that climate change is having. Best management practices for everything, for roadside ditch maintenance, for agriculture, and for everything else we look at, is historically based. So we're making decisions based upon 50 or 70 years of weather information, the conditions under which simply may not apply in the future. So we need to start with a reevaluation of the weather, climate change, and what impact that has on all aspects, including agriculture. We need to start with voluntary actions in everything we do. However, we do need to understand that if voluntary actions don't work, then we need to enter into discussions in which we find some way to make those voluntary actions enshrined and codified in some kind of law regulation, or stronger recommendation than simply saying we hope you do this. It's always best if every organization, every component in our economy, if they monitor themselves, that's the first place to go. And if that doesn't happen, then we have to look at other alternatives. We have to save the water.
Thank you, Mr. Batman. Mr. Finch will go with the issue of how to reduce agriculture's impact on the watersheds.
Well, I certainly think agriculture is a factor there. There's no question about that. There are CAFO laws that regulate how manure and byproducts from farms and fertilizers are handled. But there are other factors too that enter into the equation. We have, as Keith mentioned, golf courses. We have the inlet that brings fertilizer and other attributes from the southern part of the county all the way into Tompkins County, Cortland County. That's an issue. We also have golf courses, as I mentioned. We have septic systems that are emptying into septic systems along the lake. There is a $125 million outright grant that came through the legislature last session that provides for remediation of the septic systems. That's important. That's being done now through the Department of Health in Cayuga County. In addition to that, we have a remediation process that goes on right now. Dutch Hollow Brook was the last one to be done. The first one, as a matter of fact, the only remediation done in any of the Finger Lakes was Dutch Hollow Brook up to this point. It's been very successful. There's a tributary that comes into the lake. There are 6 other tributaries as well. All these things are factors. One interesting point was you need to bring everybody to the table. The farming community, the agriculture, the businesses, the municipalities. We've been able to do that. In fact, I've been able to do that. Actually, when you go to ALA meetings now, the Farm Bureau is part of those meetings. They're present and they're working together. And I think the only way you're going to solve this problem is to bring each stakeholder to the table and have them understand exactly the role they have to play in the whole remediation process. It's working. It's slow, but it is working.
Thank you. Mr. Boyer.
One more question on this, and we'll try to move on to other topics because we could probably do an hour on the water for sure. But you know, both of you have talked about in this campaign and in the past about the work you've each done specifically on this issue. Mr. Batman, especially as chairman of the legislature, and Mr. Finch in the assembly. And I assume you've even been in some of the same meetings that where you've been discussing how do we respond, how do we get Albany to help. So I'd like you to talk to us about each other's role in this and what you thought of each other's handling of this matter on behalf of constituents.
Mr. Finch, you're going to go first.
Well, interesting enough, there was a high-level meeting here at the college, chaired by Congressman Katko, about 2 years ago, I think it was. And we had the EPA here. We had a conference call that went through to the DEC. All the parties were present. The mayor of Auburn was here, Mr. Wagner from town of Owasco, to try to figure out exactly what we would do in the short term. I was at the meeting, Katko, as I said, Katko, Bob Oakes, the assemblyman, and Senator DeFrancisco were here, and Bob Brower, by the way, who is now deceased, but did an enormous amount of work on the lake. Probably the best science on the lake is what Bob did. And it was all decided that the one thing that we could do, the EPA almost stepped out of the equation altogether. The lakes weren't in bad enough shape for them to be involved. They're dealing with crisis all over the country. The DEC was very helpful. It was decided then that somehow they would have to do the filtering system with the charcoal, which I mentioned earlier on. And it has been successful. An interesting part of the whole meeting was at the conclusion of the, or almost at the conclusion of the meeting, Mr. Batman suggested that we didn't need to be involved, Mr. Oakes, myself, until he let us know exactly how we could help. Well, I didn't know. I said to Bob Oakes afterwards, I said, where do they think the money is going to come from? It's going to come from the state. So needless to say, we became involved. And through the efforts of myself, Oakes, DeFrancisco, that money came forth. Now there's additional money in the form of $65
Thank you, Assemblyman.
million that came from the governor's budget. That's to be implemented as well. But
Thank you.
All right.
You can have a minute later, but Mr. Batman, on the issue of how your opponent has handled water quality issues.
Well, and let me pick up on the meeting he's talking about. The meeting he's talking about had to do with was revolved around the issue of toxins in Owasco Lake. That meeting was called by Congressman Katko at the point at which local people had already made substantial strides in moving forward with a solution. That meeting was largely talk. We need to do something, here's what we should do, and so on, and there were a lot of suggestions made. My point that I was trying to make was that the solution that needs to evolve is the solution that the community was already evolving, and that it was a complication when all of these outside people come in and tell us what we need to do. We knew what we need to do. We were on the path of what we needed to do. And I believe that's true for almost all problems in the community. We need to listen to the community. The way that $2 million was achieved was, in fact, when that toxin first appeared, I called together a meeting of the elected officials in Owasco, the Cayuga County, and the town of Auburn, along with their staffs, along with DEC and the health department. And we had a meeting in the county office building in which we discussed the problem and what we were going to do. From that meeting, we decided on a path of action, a course of action, and we were engaged in that course of action when Mr. Katko called this meeting. So my point was, we're on our way. Don't complicate the solution. Don't get involved with political posturing or anything else. It was a result of that effort, in fact, that resulted in the $2 million. It's not necessarily, I don't mean this is critical of Mr. Finch or Mr. Oakes or anyone else, but they had virtually no role in securing that money. That money was secured through the efforts of the town of Owasco, the county of Cayuga, and the city of Auburn in conjunction with the governor's office, DEC, and others.
Well,
Mr. Finch, you'll get 1 minute.
I think I will comment. It's nice to know that the efforts that we took evidently have fallen on deaf ears. I know that money I know where that money came from, and it came from the state of New York, and it came through the efforts of Oakes, DeFrancisco, and myself, working together with the other stakeholders to bring that money forward. It's a collaborative effort. I agree with Mr. Batman on that, but it takes all parties, the ability to work together. That's why things get done. And that's why and when it doesn't happen that way, things get stopped. They get blocked. It becomes political. It becomes partisan. And that's what we don't need.
Mr. Batman, you'll have 1 minute too.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that we need to avoid the partisanship and the political, and that was my point at that meeting. As I say, we were on a path. There's lots that has been done by the U.S. Senate, by Senator Helmy, by Senator DeFrancisco, by Senator Seward. They have produced money. They've taken money that they had access to and put it in this community. The $2 million for the toxin treatment was not one of them. It did come from the state. It came through the efforts of the local community, local politicians, local groups, the governor's office, and DEC. I mean, that is simply the facts. Those facts can be checked, but obviously not here today. I'm not suggesting that we need to be partisan. I'm not suggesting that we need not to be inclusive. We do. What I'm suggesting is when the local communities have a path forward. The role of the state, the role of the federal government, the role of Albany is to get behind those efforts and not complicate those efforts with alternative plans, ideas, or directions.
Thank you. Mr. Boyer.
All right, well, we'll shift to another topic. Hopefully this is like a 1 or 2 round question, but a big one in the southern half of Cayuga County especially is the Cayuga Land into Trust issue. We still are waiting on the Bureau of Indian Affairs to tell us what their decision is on an application. They would essentially take land out, off the tax rolls and in theory let the Cayuga Nation expand their gambling and do whatever else they want to do on that property. With that in mind, we've had local response, we've had state response. At this point, I'd like to know from both of you, though, what has your approach to this issue been, and it's been going on for decades, and what do you want to see happening as we go forward?
Legislator Batman, you'll start us off on this issue of land claims.
Okay. We've made really substantial progress in the last several years on the issue. We're not nearly as polarized as we were before. We're not nearly as divided as we were before, and that's all good. The fundamental issue comes down to this. Once the internal argument within the Cayuga Nation is resolved, and it would appear to be on the way to resolution now, to determine who's in charge, then the question becomes, who are we going to talk to and about what? And who's going to be involved in those discussions? This is an example where we do need community leadership along with the state. We need to get the people together that are most involved, the people in the southern part of the county, as well as other representatives from Cayuga County and the state, to really talk about what we want to do and what path we have forward. The court challenges will continue, and we need to understand that. There's an intent on both the part of some Cayuga County municipalities in the county and Seneca County particularly to continue those court actions. In the meantime, we need to decide the extent to which we're prepared to sit down and to begin discussions with the Cayuga Indian Nations about what we need in terms of how that path is going to move forward. Once the Bureau of Indian Affairs does decide, if they decide, that the Cayuga should have land into trust, at that point, it's game over. Once they have a land into trust, then they in effect become the sovereign nation, and we have much less ability to discuss or to move them in any direction. So one of the things we have to decide, and this decision has not been made, I want to make that clear, one of the things we need to decide is what position do we take kind of in the short and intermediate term to ensure that the needs and the welfare of southern Cayuga County are considered in topmost priority as we move forward with a solution to this problem.
Thank you. Assemblyman Finch, this issue of land into trust in the southern part of the county.
I think the land claim, actually I live in the land claim, and it's been around now for almost over 200 years. And I don't think we're going to be able to solve it. I think for all the reasons that become very apparent, they want it to go on. They want the situation to develop as the way it is. So right now the property is coming off the tax rolls. The state of New York is really picking up the tab, the taxpayer. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is very, very pro-Native American. I expect them to come back with a declaration of land in trust for them. There's not much we can do. We fought in the courts, we've battled it, and every time you turn around, we win the court battles, but yet we still lose. So I don't know what the answer is, I have to tell you that. And I look out my window and see the land and see that we think we own it, but there's a claim on it. So it's a very difficult situation.
Okay. Just as a matter of record, where we are right now is we're in the 126th Assembly District Forum here at Cayuga Community College. This is sponsored by the college and the Citizen. Candidates who are in the order of their draw are Assemblyman Gary D. Finch, who is the incumbent. He's on the Republican, Conservative, Independent, and Reform lines, as well as Cayuga County Legislator Keith Batman, who's on the Democratic, Women's Equality Party, and Working Families Party. They're being asked questions by Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen. Mr. Boyer.
All right, thanks. Let's get into Albany's corruption and ethical issues, because that's always a concern that we talk about at these forums, and not quite sure how much progress we've made over the years, but it continues to be something that most campaigns have some ideas for how they think things could get improved. So I'd basically just like to put that to both of you. Where do you start when it comes to dealing with corruption and ethical lapses in Albany?
And I think we're now starting with Mr. Finch, because Mr. Batman did the land and trust.
There's no question that that there is a corruption issue with Albany, an ethical issue. I mean, I've seen multiple people go off to jail in the last 20 years. We've passed some legislation that deprives members of the Assembly and the Senate to forfeit their pension in the event that they're indicted for crimes related to their office, such as taking bribes. As we just witnessed, a colleague of ours, Mr. Arrigo, took a bribe, and so he's been indicted. There is a lack of transparency down in Albany. Member item money is another issue. Something that that I've been, that Mr. Batman says I don't bring home enough resources from Albany. But when you do that, it needs to be clear and open about what you're doing and where it's going, and if it goes to nonprofit, for example. A lot of member initiative money has found its way to nonprofit organizations down in New York City, and they're mostly shells, operations just to funnel money through. These things are clearly wrong. What we need to do is have a commission made up of independent people to oversee these issues, not appointed by the legislature. That's important. We need to do that, and so far that hasn't happened at all.
Thank you, Settleman. Legislator, this issue of corruption in your agenda.
Yeah, I think obviously the issue of corruption is a big one, and it's that one of the reasons it's so critical is because it undermines all of our faiths in government. It undermines our faith in people like me and like Mr. Finch, people that are elected to do the public work. And I find it offensive. It's personally offensive. I'm an elected official, and I try to maintain the highest ethical standards. What we need to do are several things. One is we need term limits. Once someone has been in office for too long, then they tend, in Mr. Finch's word, get complacent. I think that's absolutely true. We need to make certain that there's movement in all these offices. I think we need to do away with the LLC loopholes. We need to make sure that money that goes to campaigns is transparent, clear, and that we know where it's coming from and where it's going. I totally agree that we need the transparency in all government operations, in economic development and other things. A dollar of taxpayer money spent should be a dollar that is trackable and a dollar that people understand. That's all critically important. I also agree that we need an independent commission, and we'll fight to move that forward, a commission that is independent of the governor, of the legislature, and that has funding that is independent. And there are proposals to do just that. I would add a final aspect that we need to remember, and that has to do with ethics and morality, and that has to do with voter reform. The most important thing that we can do, or at least one of the most important things that we can do, is to make certain that people have the ability to vote. We should have no excuse absenteeism. We should have the longer voting times. We should have easier registration. I also want to point out one last thing in terms of this issue. The issue of ethics and morality is not an issue of not breaking the law. The issue of ethics is doing the right thing. And I think we always talk about staying within the law. That's not enough. You know, we need to do more than that. And I would take this opportunity to ask Mr. Finch about some of his ethical lapses, because I think those are critically important that we understand and discuss. So if I may pose a question.
Well, the questions come from Mr. Boyer. You have to wrap up, and Mr. Finch wants to answer. That's up to him.
Well, it's up to you. I mean, I can go to another question along this line, or if you want to react to any of that. I
guess I'll choose not to react, since the only thing was I was going to pose a question, and it was left up in the air. So I guess we'll leave it there at the moment, unless you want to rephrase it.
Well, what I'm guessing Mr. Batman's referring to is we did some reporting back in 2017 about a former staffer of yours who was working hours that were called into question whether he could have actually been working, since he seemed to be either in Florida or was it maybe even in the hospital. And it raised questions about, you know, oversight of staff and transparency in that aspect of how money is spent in Albany. So if you want to talk about that issue.
Comment, I guess the only comment I'll say is that we're referring to a Mr. Galbato who worked for us, for me, for the office, and before that he worked for Tarky Lombardi and Clarence Rapelier as well. And he worked every hour he was put in. He put on the timesheet. The only time that there was a mistake in his hours was the fact that when he had a heart attack on Mother's Day. He was a valuable employee. I would keep him on now if it weren't for the fact that he had the heart attack. He brought a lot of information to the table. His wife was killed by a drunk driver, and he brought all that information and guidance to us on drunk driving, which has affected the way we run the office. No, there was no ethical issue there whatsoever. He worked for every dime he got, and he was making minimum wage at the time. The matter is settled as far as I know.
Okay. Mr. Finch, that was directed to Mr. Finch. Mr. Batman, if you want to respond, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, of course, I don't have first-hand information about this. I wasn't there. I wasn't signing the timesheets. Mr. Finch was. What I know about it is the investigative reporting that was done by Robert Harding on the Auburn Citizen staff. That investigative report paints a whole different picture in terms of what actually happened, in terms of falsifying timesheets, getting paid for time that wasn't worked, receiving benefits for time that wasn't worked. So I can't personally address this issue. I would point to the public record and let people make their own decision.
Just a quick follow-up from Mr. Finch, because you did mention you said the one issue or the one lapse was with the timesheet after Mr. Galbato suffered the heart attack. You did sign that original timesheet. Was that something that you signed without just thinking through what he was actually saying was the hours that were down, or can you walk through what happened there?
The hours that were put down mistakenly, and it was for that. He was in the hospital at the time the hours were put down. That was a mistake, which was rectified.
Right, but when you signed that timesheet, it didn't occur to you that should have been there?
It did not, really.
Mr. Batman, you'll have 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, we'll turn over to Mr. Boyer.
We'll move on to a decision that has to be made, I believe. Well, I don't know. Is I-81 in the district? It technically is not, right, but it certainly affects this district. Whether to build a tunnel, build a boulevard, build a tunnel boulevard, build a viaduct. Something has to be done, though, and it could affect how traffic comes through our region. So I'd like to hear from both of you on what you'd like to see happen with this decision.
Okay, and Mr. Finch had done the last several questions because they were directed to him. We'll start with Mr. Batman on the issue of I-81.
Yeah, and I-81 is an issue that affects us. The concern that we have in the 126 is what happens to the traffic that goes through Syracuse. Anything that diverts traffic onto our roads is a problem, is a concern. We've already experienced increased truck traffic through Skaneateles, through Aurora, through Owasco, and through other places. And so any diversion is something that is of great concern to us. In some respects, in many respects, I don't care what Syracuse does with I-81. They should make a decision based upon what's good for that community, with an understanding, however, that it's not what they do is not something that affects only them. This is not a case where what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, or whatever the cliche is. And that has to be taken into account. And that's my concern. Whether they do a tunnel, rebuild I-81 as it is, do I can't even remember what it's called, the downtown, the boulevard process. Whatever they do, part of the process has to be a much more in-depth study of where that traffic is going to go, and that has to enter into the decision. Maybe that's been done and I'm just not aware of it. I don't have insider information on any of this, but if it hasn't been done, it needs to be done. We need to know what impact their decisions are going to have in our communities. And if we don't know, we need to do a timeout until we do know, and then we need to have input into how that's going to move forward.
Thank you, Legislator. Assemblyman Finch, the issue of I-81.
Well, I-81 is the main thoroughfare, I guess you would say, north-south direction. It meets Route 90, Interstate 90. I support the concept of keeping it north-south the way it is right now. Perhaps a tunnel would work best, but most expensive. A lower boulevard area would probably be the one that we ultimately will decide on. There's a grid, they call it, where they have multiple exits off the 81 into the city. That's probably the most complex way of taking traffic and moving it, and it will be moved in our direction. And we're talking about a lot of truck traffic more than anything else, and that truck traffic is involving trash from New York City. The original plan was to take everything up and move it around past the Carousel Mall, way up around the airport, and bring the traffic back down through. That plan is very weak as well. The big problem, as I said, is the trash. It moves to Seneca Meadows. It goes to another landfill beyond that in Ontario County. Those are the real issues at stake, and the traffic that brings through the Finger Lakes. And the decision will finally be made by the federal government. They're paying 90% of the bill, although the governor has some influence.
So I'm not sure if I heard a specific choice from either of you. Is that sort of the case for both of you as far as which option you think should happen?
I think ultimately the option will be the depressed highway through the city, a boulevard. That it'll follow the
not what
path
not what will happen, but what you believe or what you advocate for.
I would prefer that way, either a partial tunnel or depressed highway,
okay,
north-south.
And Mr. Batman?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I prefer whatever option Syracuse wants to put in place, as long as it does not result in increased truck traffic and other traffic in our communities. And I'm not sure what that option is, but that, I think, from our perspective, is the issue. We cannot have additional traffic on our roads.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay. Well, economic development is certainly a big topic in the last 8 years under Governor Cuomo, with not only the high-profile convictions we saw involving some of the bigger spending, but also the Regional Economic Development Council model and how that has worked to divide the state up into regions and have each region compete for various pools of money. Can you critique that process, if you think it should be kept, and what changes or modifications you would make going forward?
Assemblyman Finch, you'll have 2 minutes on this issue of the Red Seas.
Well, it's pretty hard to criticize the governor's competition since Auburn has been the great recipient of much of that money. But it is unfair, and there should be another plan put into place. The Southern Tier, which is an area that I used to represent before redistricting, gets very little attention. And part of it is because they don't have the grant writers, they don't have the individuals that can put together the plan that's needed to satisfy the governor's need for competition on this issue. So that's really unfair, and it's a bad way to do it, even though we've been the recipients of much of it here in Auburn. What I would do, I would let, first of all, maybe the best way to handle economic development is to keep our taxes lower, to keep a level playing field, not to take $20 million of the taxpayers' money and use it for that. Why not let the taxpayer keep the money? And why not let businesses thrive based on a level playing field where they're not competing with everyone? That's something we should consider. Less taxes, more jobs. That's something that's very important. To pit areas of the state together against each other is not the way to go. Even though, as I mentioned, Auburn has been a great benefactor from it, it's still not the appropriate way to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Silverman. Legislator, how do you handle the Red Sea process?
Right. Well, I would agree. Less taxes, more jobs. That's like the, that's apple pie. I think we all agree with that. I'm not sure exactly what that means. In terms of the REDC, which is, I think, is the question, we need to remember prior to this process with the REDCs, the process that we used was we wrote to Albany. We went to Albany. We talked with bureaucrats. Some of them were experts, some weren't. But it was all centralized in Albany. All decisions were made in Albany. All money flowed from Albany. The RDC was an attempt to decentralize that process, to give the community an input into the process. And I am absolutely in favor of community action, of getting having community people decide priorities for themselves. The problem with the RDCs is that they haven't fulfilled their promise. But I think that what we need to do is to revise the process and not simply throw out the idea because the idea is sound. I think we need to look at economic development as local, regional, and state. And when it's local and regional, then we need to have local and regional people making those decisions. We need certainly more transparency in this process. I said this before, and because I believe it. Every dollar of taxpayer money spent should be a dollar that is trackable and a dollar that is accessible to anyone, any taxpayer. We should all know where that money goes. So it needs to be more transparent. I think there needs to be a system that understands that economic development is local, regional, and statewide, and that the RDCs need to be modified so that the local people have a little more influence, the regional people have influence on regional projects, but to understand that some projects have statewide ramifications, and that there will have to be and need to be, and appropriately are statewide, the issues associated with it. So my suggestion would be keep the REDCs, but reorganize them in a way so that they're more locally focused, more community focused, more regionally focused.
All right, thank you. Mr. Boyer.
I think you've both talked a little bit about education earlier in your opening statements, and public education funding has been a battle for a lot of districts in this district, including Auburn. The state aid formula is complicated and complex, but if you talk to some of the people that understand it, they say Auburn is not getting even close to its fair share. But what can you do as an assemblyman? What have you done? What can you do to change things in Albany? So I'd like to both of you talk about what would be your plan to address education funding.
We'll go with Legislator Batman first.
Yeah. This one makes me smile. It's like what would you do to solve the problems of the world? Well, first, it's a huge problem, and one of the things that I often quote, and I don't know who said it, but I love the quote, and that is that there are 3 people in Albany that understand the state aid formula for public education. 2 of them aren't talking. So the complexity of this is the problem. I would move and argue to simplify the process, and how we go about doing that. I don't have I don't have an answer to that. I know the process, and the process is to get the people in the room that have the knowledge in public education, the state education department, legislators and others, and understand that the problem is the allocation of resources, and that's where we start. And we have to come up with something. There are court decisions that aren't being fully implemented. We have to implement those, and I think we start with that process, a process of discussion. And again, I come back always to the community, because I think that's where all solutions begin. The other thing I point out, though, when we talk about this is the way we fund education. New York is one of the few states in the nation that funds education in local municipalities through property taxes. Property taxes are the tax that hit the middle class, working class people the hardest. This isn't the long run solution we need to have. We need to change how we fund the education, not simply how we distribute the money, but where that money comes from. And I would advocate that we begin that discussion sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Legislator. Assemblyman Finch, on the issue of education funding in local districts like Auburn.
Well, the formula is almost impossible to even comprehend. How they put it together and who puts it together. The school runs to look at them. You can't make head or tail out of them. Even when you think you know, the money doesn't flow in the right direction. New York State itself puts about $23 billion into the education process. That's part of the New York State budget. The rest of the money comes from property taxes. So you have the school runs that come from the they're factored into the 23 billion. Then on the local level, you have the school tax, the property tax that comes into the equation as well. The distribution of that is very inequitable. I like to tell a story of, there's a school, West Jennings, outstanding school, just a few miles from here. And you get on a bicycle and you can ride for another mile and a half into the inner city of Syracuse, and the graduation rates are like 30%. West Genesee is almost 100. And the fact that they have an orchestra with 37 violins in it and cellos, all kinds of wonderful things other schools are deprived of. There's no fair system, and that's the problem. Somewhere along the line, the property tax and the combination of the $23 billion breakdown has to be dealt with in a different area, a different way, more equitable, and a dollar for dollar rather than school district by school district. Rich districts, Westchester County, those are the districts that get most of the money, most of the aid. It's so totally unfair.
Okay. Mr. Batman, you have 1 minute for a response.
Yeah, well, it's not exactly a response, but I think that Ms. Finch brought up a really important point, and I want to credit him with it. And it needs to be emphasized, and that is the problem with the education is it takes place in a larger context, and that context is an economic context. It's poverty. Until we solve the problem of poverty in our communities, we will not have a solution to education, our education problems. We will not have a solution to the desperate nature of the funding. And so it's important that we understand that the education is within our community, within our culture, within our society, within our economy, and we need to approach it that way and consider programs that anti-poverty programs that seek to improve the quality of life in our community is actually education programs as well as economic development programs.
Thank you. Mr. Boyer, you're down to your last question after 5 hours of doing this.
One question, yeah. Well, I think, a lot of, what people are going to look at here is a choice of, someone, you can argue experience versus inexperience in Albany, or you could argue downstate Democratic control of the Assembly or a Republican representative. So, and I know both of you have kind of gone back and forth in this campaign over whether it's fair to, or whether it's appropriate to tout, being in the majority or being in the minority as a reason for people to vote for one candidate or another. So I guess I'd ask you both that question is, why should voters choose someone based on a conference membership?
So to try to get to our closing statements in a timely fashion, we'll start with Assemblyman Finch on this issue and then Mr. Batman.
Well, I don't think people should make their choice based on if you're a Republican or a Democrat, quite frankly, whether you're in the majority or the minority. It's a question of what you can do. It's a question about leadership. It's a question about being able to work with your colleagues. That's the important part. You be able to work across the aisle. I think being in the minority, from that sense, gives you the ability to speak out more, talk about issues. I think you don't have to march in lockstep with the speaker. But the issue really is, in this race, is the ability to work with others, not to grandstand, not to be the lone, not to be the hero that steps up on the scene and takes all the credit. No, what you need to do is be able to work in a collegial manner, bringing all parties together, and it's been successful for me to do that. I work with the Senate, I work with my colleagues in the Assembly. We do bring resources here when we can, as evidenced by what we were able to do with the toxins on the lake. And there are other issues that are going to be brought forward. There'll be an announcement later on, maybe this week or next week, in reference to another lake initiative with some buoys that are going to be put out. So it's a constant working together. That's what I see my role, is that more than anything else.
Legislator Batman?
Yeah, and certainly it's important to work collaboratively and with your colleagues. I, however, think this is New York State. It's naive to think that when you get to Albany, the party affiliation and connections don't matter. They simply do. As a member of the majority, I will be in a better position to get the resources we need here. I'll be in a better position to work with which is likely to be a Republican or a Democratic Senate to get the resources we need. However, I would point out that I too have worked with Senator Helming on a number of issues, so I can work across the aisle when necessary and to get things done. That's what we all want to do. But it's also important to have someone there has the connections to get the resources we need. Mr. Boyer mentioned upstate and downstate. That's not an issue for me. I'm very clear on where my priorities are. I often say my priorities are family, community, and then party. And unfortunately, sometimes community comes before family in terms of the hours I spend. But my point is that what's good for this community is what I will focus on. I will be in a better position as a Democrat, quite frankly, to meet the needs of the community. It's the way our system works. We can rail against it, we can not like it, and believe me, sometimes I don't like it, but it's the way it works, and I plan to deliver.
Thank you. We'll now turn to your closing statements. As we said at the beginning, we did a draw. Cuyahoga County Legislator Keith Batman will speak first. He is on the Democratic Women's Equality Party and Working Families Party line. Legislator. Yeah.
Well, of course, thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to the students. Thank you, Mr. Boyer. Thank you, Mr. Costantino. It's been a pleasure. I think we've had the opportunity to see some ways that Mr. Finch and I agree, some ways we disagree. I would point out that what I bring to this position is hardworking, energetic focus that will serve the community well. I'll be tenacious. I will be focused. I will do what this community needs to get the resources we need from Albany. I consider myself a particularly ethical person, and I'll take that. People will know where I stand. They'll know what I am doing, and I will listen. I think if we look at what we've done so far, in all this process, it comes down to a difference between a community focus and another focus. Mine is with the community. I think Mr. Finch has been in office 20 years, and I'll leave it to the voters to decide what has been accomplished in that 20 years. That's not for me to say, and I'm not even sure if it's for him to say. The voters will decide that. What I do say is this: give me 2 years and I will deliver. If you send Batman to Albany, Batman will deliver, I will deliver, and that's why I ask for your vote.
Thank you, Legislator. We'll now hear from New York State Assemblyman Gary D. Finch, who's on the Republican, Conservative, Independent, and Reform Party lines. Mr. Finch.
I think my strength is in the ability to work with my colleagues to articulate the issues that are most important to the people here in our district, our neighbors. We have multiple issues, as I mentioned. We didn't even discuss the opium heroin epidemic that's taking so many of our young adults. That's very important. We need to do something about that. We are lacking in rehab centers and in areas where detox centers. We don't have enough of those in New York State. This is something that's very important. So the issues that I'm dealing with are on the ground. They're actually, we face every day of the week. Our neighbors face them as well. That's important. And the ability to bring back resources, to me, is insignificant, quite frankly. It's a poor system we have. It just does not work, and it's not transparent. We need to be more open, and that's what we need to do in Albany. I have stand on my record, which I feel is sound. It's been a record of service, and it's been, and I've been able to assist many families. One of the things we also do is we have great constituent service. We haven't even discussed that at all either. But our office works with many families. With the last phone call someone makes is to our office because they've been turned down and by every agency in the state of New York. So we find our way around that as well. These are all supremely important issues that we have. That's about where I stand. I expect to be sent back. I hope to be. I think I've responded to the needs of the people we represent, and I'm hopeful they'll return me.
Thank you, Assemblyman. You have been hearing the candidates for the 126 Assembly districts. We wanted to thank them for taking the time to come into the studio to answer questions and also for putting themselves out there. As has been indicated, it is not always easy on the families that go along with this process, but we thank you for putting yourselves out there. We also want to thank Mr. Boyer, who I said just a few minutes ago has done 5 hours worth of this questioning in the last 2 weeks. Most importantly, though, we want to thank you, our viewers, for taking the time to listen over the last the last hour to the Senate candidates and the Assembly candidates over the last several weeks. We want to thank you for watching, and we want to hope that you will go to the polls to exercise your right to vote on November 6th. The Citizen on their website, auburnpub.com, has these forums online tonight and can be viewed there, or you can turn into the college's YouTube station by going to Media Cayuga. That will also show you all of these forums as well. A quick programming note, this is our final final forum for 2018. And we'll not have any shows on November 6th, Election Day. We hope you're going out at that time to go vote. We'll return to our regular programming in 2 weeks. We have interviews with Senator DeFrancisco and outgoing Sheriff David Gould, a discussion about the changes at Hospice of the Finger Lakes, a city update from City Manager Jeff Dygert, and an overview of the referendum going before the voters on a capital project in January with Superintendent of Schools Jeff Perazola. We hope you will join us again in 2 weeks, and between now and then, go out and vote. For Cayuga Community College and the Citizen, I'm Guy Cosentino. Thank you, have a good night, and enjoy the rest of your week.